Hi, and welcome back to Platonic Soul. I hope you've been well. So I'm kind of excited today because for the first time in this series on Platonic love, we're going to be actually digging into the dialogue that is really Plato's great manifesto on love, or really rather on Eros, which generally for the Greeks meant something like what it means for us, actually, more or less sexual love or desire. Although, as we'll see, in Plato's hands, this word will take on a much wider, perhaps you could even say infinitely wider sense. The dialogue I'm talking about is, of course, the Symposium, and we're finally past looking at it in a sort of introductory way, to the point where today, I think, we'll get at least some sense of Plato's own views on love and desire. As you may know if you've been watching this series or if you're already familiar with the Symposium, it's essentially a series of speeches given at a drinking party on the topic of Eros. More specifically, by partygoers who have been challenged to make the most beautiful speech in praise of it. Of course, the speech of Socrates caps them all, although, as we'll see, it's not quite the last speech. Today I want to start talking about the first 5 speeches, the ones that come before, and in a way, I think, build to the climax represented by Socrates' speech. As I've mentioned in previous episodes, you might find here ideas that take you aback, others that might seem quite relatable to your own inner life, your experiences with love and desire. And you may find quite a few that are actually both. I'd say it's to find this, the startlingly relatable, perhaps more than anything else, that we go to old books, the humanities in general. You might also find parts of these speeches quite moving. I might as well tell you I was originally unsure how to approach this part of the Symposium in this video series. The main reason for that, I think, really is that it's not a philosophical treatise. It's really a work of what we would today call philosophical literature. Part of the point here is to tell a beautiful story rather than to jump straight into expounding the author's doctrine through a logical procession. And in fact, we have to read through quite a bit of the work to get to the real kernel of Plato's thought about Eros, the speech, of course, of Socrates. To get, in other words, to what we can really call Platonic love. So I thought, since I'm interested in this series and explaining Plato's teaching on love to people, maybe all I really need to do here is skip past these 5 speeches and cut to the Socratic core of the dialogue. But as I got closer and closer to making this video, I got increasingly uncomfortable with the idea of skipping these first 5 speeches. And I think I know why that is now. There are actually a couple of reasons. One is that, and I'll really only get more deeply into this in my next episode, these speeches serve a useful purpose in the dialogue of repeatedly suggesting this problem of the fundamental unity of the soul. It's something that nags, or at least might nag at us as we read them. And since that's my take on this dialogue, that it's really about the fundamental unity or dividedness, the question of whether the human personality or psyche is fundamentally divided or fundamentally one, I thought there's some worth in going through these speeches because they hint at that problem. But I think the main reason why I want to go through these speeches is that there's a great beauty to them. And it's actually quite important because, as we'll see, Plato's solution to this problem of the fundamental unity of the human psyche will ultimately depend on this idea that beauty and truth can, in some sense, hardly be separated. Some of the dialogue's beauty touches us as beauty does in a strange way that perhaps bypasses our ability to fully analyze it. Some of it, I think, can be, in a way, brought more to light. For example, the harmony in the dialogue. And I'll talk a bit more about that at the end of this episode. So, on to the speeches, which I'll briefly recap, and I'll share some of my own thoughts about them today. The young Phaedrus leads off. It seems to have been on his initial suggestion that Eryximachus proposed the idea of everybody speaking in praise of Eros. So it's kind of natural that he leads off. Eros, he says, is the oldest god. So he seems to be getting at the idea of Eros being primal in some way, fundamental. Eros, he says, is also, quote, cause of the greatest goods, unquote. Both what you could call the objective and subjective good. In other words, both goodness, as we usually think of it, virtue, and happiness. Aristophanes and Eryximachus, that's the older Greek lover and the younger beloved, spur each other, Phaedrus says, to virtuous deeds, trying to impress each other and to avoid shame. And the gods, Phaedrus says, reward loyal lovers with happiness in the next life. So there's an idea here of Eros having the potential to bring us a kind of happiness outside the mundane, outside the everyday. At this point in the dialogue, we're reminded of this seemingly deliberate motif of unreliability that fascinatingly crops up a few times in the dialogue, and that I think I'd like to get to later in this series. The narrator Apollodorus says his own source, Aristodemus, because remember, Apollodorus was never actually there at the Symposium. He says that Aristodemus told him there were then a few more speeches he could hardly remember. So we skip ahead to the speech of Pausanias, who seems something of a legal expert. The great contribution of Pausanias is to basically split Eros. It doesn't, he says, necessarily lead people to virtue. Rather, there are earthly and heavenly Aphrodites, and therefore earthly and heavenly Erotes. And I've talked before about these speeches being both serious and comical, and there's something absurd about a goddess having this dual nature. It's in fact this whole divine family of Aphrodite and her son being split up, divided into two pairs. So those spurred by the earthly pair, he says, are, quote, in love with women no less than boys, unquote, with their bodies rather than their souls, and, quote, they have an eye only to the act. Men, and at least superficially we're talking almost entirely about men in these speeches. There will be an exception, a notable one later on. Men moved by the heavenly Eros, he says, are attracted only to youths, and their love is lasting, and with regard to the virtue of the beloved youth, the Eryximachus. So, whether Eros fosters virtue or vice in the psyche, in the human personality, Pausanias says, depends on what kind of Eros it is. And this, in turn, seems to depend on its object. It can take these different kinds of objects. We next get to the speech of the doctor Eryximachus. He keeps this idea of a double Eros and kind of runs with it. This double Eros, he says, is all-powerful. It transcends the merely human, the world of consciousness and abstractive thought. He says, Eros presides not only over the souls of human beings in regard to the beautiful, but also in regard to many other things and in other cases, the bodies of all the animals as well as those things that grow in the earth, and just about all the things that are. Eros, or attraction, if you like, brings harmony to nature, but it can also bring discord. And the point of the various human arts is to foster the kind of eros that brings things into harmony. Thus he speaks of medicine as, quote, the erotics of the body, unquote, music as the erotics of harmony and rhythm, unquote, and religion as the erotics of the sacred, he says. All the sacrifices and things over which divination presides, these are concerned with the communing of gods and human beings with one another. And there could be a pun here because this word he uses for communing, koinonia, can also mean communing in a sexual sense. These are concerned with the communing of gods and human beings with one another. They involved almost nothing but the protection and healing of Eros. Divination is the craftsman of friendship between gods and human beings, since it has expert knowledge of human erotics, as far as erotics has to do with sacred law and piety. So for Eryximachus, the proper direction of Eros is necessary for all things to reach their potential, to flourish. And he says, this is the great and overwhelming power that Eros as a whole has. And indeed, it is rather close to total power. So the second last of these 5 speeches belongs to Aristophanes, the great Athenian writer of comedies. Of all the 5, I think this one shows up the most in our contemporary culture. It's probably the best known outside the academic world. It played an important role, for example, in the 1998 musical Hedwig and the Angry Inch, which was made into a movie a few years later. And one of the songs from the movie, called The Origin of Love, basically retells, with a few minor tweaks, the myth that Aristophanes tells us here. It's a myth of his own invention, and it's very Aristophanic, you'll see. You can find this song, The Origin of Love, on YouTube, or at least it was still up when I was making this video. I find it hard not to think, in connection with Aristophanes' speech, that debate that Socrates is reported to be having at the end of this party when the roosters are starting to crow and almost everyone has passed out or left. He's arguing with the last holdouts that the same poet can competently write both comedy and tragedy, because there's such a wondrous pathos alongside the delightful absurdity of Aristophanes' myth. Originally, he says, humans were these strange spherical creatures of 3 different kinds. Those who were basically 2 conjoined males, those who were 2 conjoined females, and those who were 1 male and 1 female joined with one another. Eros, he says, began when Zeus split them all in 2 to punish them for their insolence. Aristophanes says, they were awesome in their strength and robustness, which is so delightfully absurd. You try to imagine these spherical creatures with 2 pairs of arms and legs and genitals sort of being imposing in any conceivable way. They were awesome in their strength and robustness and had great and proud thoughts, so they made an attempt on the gods. This is how Aristophanes, so Zeus split them all in 2 to punish them for their insolence, as I said, and this left each half trying to find its original partner. And it's how Aristophanes explains what we would now call sexual orientation. He says, it is really from such early times that human beings have had inborn in themselves Eros for one another. Eros, the bringer together of their ancient nature, who tries to make 1 out of 2 and to heal their human nature. Each of us then is a token of a human being because we are sliced like fillets of soul, two out of one. And so each is always in search of his own token, he says. Significantly for Aristophanes, humanity doesn't remember its origin. So lovers are never really able to put into words what it is they want. He says, here you have those who continue through life with one another, though they could not even say what they want to get for themselves from one another. For no one would be of the opinion that it was sexual intercourse, and the Greek here is actually ton aphrodison synousia, the Aphroditean communion. No one would be of the opinion that the Aphroditean communion is what was wanted, as though it were for this reason of all things that each so enjoys being with the other in great earnestness. But the soul of each plainly wants something else. What it is incapable of saying, but it divines what it wants and speaks in riddles. With Aristophanes, we also get back to this point made earlier by Eryximachus when he first proposed these speeches as the evening's activity, that Eros is unworshipped. It's unrecognized by us in some way. Aristophanes says, human beings, in my opinion, have been entirely unaware of the power of Eros, since if they were aware of it, they would have provided the greatest sanctuaries and altars for him, and would be making him the greatest sacrifices, and not act as they do now, when none of this happens to him, though it most certainly should. For Eros is the most philanthropic of gods, a helper of human beings, as well as a physician dealing with an illness, the healing of which would result in the greatest happiness for the human race. So for Aristophanes, there's a basic wound in human nature, and I think he's really getting through his myth at a primarily psychological wound, or psychic or spiritual wound. I'm reminded here of those words of Harvard philosophy professor Christine Korsgaard that I quoted in an earlier episode. It may be worth quoting in this context, even though I think perhaps they're, in a way, a bit of a truism, actually. Human beings seem psychologically damaged in ways that suggest some deep break with nature. And for Aristophanes, it's Eros that aims to heal this wound, but unconsciously. Thus, the object of Eros seems inarticulable, and also something different from what it may appear at first. That's to say, there's something illusory about physical union being the ultimate aim of Eros. It's as though it's a physical problem with a psychological or spiritual solution. Anyway, the last to speak before Socrates is Agathon, the writer of tragedies at whose house this drinking party is taking place. Agathon's speech hasn't been really highly regarded by critics, actually. And it hasn't really helped that Socrates sort of destroys it when he starts speaking. There's a tendency to treat Agathon's speech, according to University of Ottawa scholar Francisco Gonzalez in a recent paper, as the most superficial and philosophically vacuous of Plato's Symposium. But actually, I think Agathon makes some important points, and his speech is probably at least as important as the others. He opens by saying that none of the other speakers has tried to state of what kind Eros is and what this god causes. And so Agathon first goes into the attributes of Eros and ends by describing the things that this god brings to humans and other gods. We talked about Socrates' speech being the obvious climax. There's also a sense in which Agathon's speech marks a bit of a climax, actually, because in it, this praise of Eros actually becomes quite unbridled. Eros, he says, is the happiest, most beautiful, and also youngest of all the gods. And in attributing youth to Eros, Agathon is aware of going against Phaedrus here, who we remember just said Eros was the oldest of the gods. Eros, Agathon says, is also soft, supple, harmonious, just, moderate, all-powerful, brave, and wise. So he thus possesses all four of the classical Greek virtues: justice, moderation, bravery, and wisdom. The wisdom Agathon attributes to Eros seems to be a special kind of wisdom, though, actually. It seems to manifest itself in the arts as inspiration. Everyone whom Eros touches proves to be a poet, though he be without the muses before, Agathon says. Eros, he continues, quote, empties us of estrangement, and the Greek word here is allotriotes, which can also be translated as alienation or otherness. And Agathon follows this up with a long string of the blessings brought by this god, that he also describes at one point as a savior. He is, Agathon winds up, quote, and I'm repeating a bit here from my previous episode, the ornament of all gods and human beings, the fairest and best guide, whom every real man must follow, hymning beautifully, and sharing the song Eros sings, in charming the thought of all gods and human beings. So there's a lot to interpret here, but there are some things I think worth particularly singling out. The perpetual youth of Eros, I think, suggests a kind of transcendence of time. He avoids old age, Agathon says. And perhaps also a sense that Eros is in some way essential to fullness of life. He says, Eros does not settle on what is fading and has passed its bloom, whether it be body or soul or anything else. But wherever a place is blooming and scented, there he settles and remains. There's something particularly significant, I think, about the softness of Eros. Agathon says, on the softest of beings he walks and dwells, for he has set up his dwelling place in the characters and souls of gods and human beings, and not in each and every soul, for whichever soul he finds to have a hard character he goes away from, and whichever one he finds to have a soft one he dwells in. The softness or tenderness of Eros to me seems closely related to the central role of the god for Agathon in artistic inspiration. What we seem to be talking about here, I think, is a kind of wisdom or knowledge or cognition that is not abstract. It's getting back a bit to what Aristophanes talked about, this sort of divining, not really being able to articulate, but somehow divining and having this sort of cognition through symbol, maybe. Tenderness in a relationship has to do with a kind of emotional intelligence, a kind of seeing into oneself and the other that is immediate rather than conceptual, really. And it tends to be more amenable to responsiveness to the other, I think, than abstract knowledge. Sensitivity, in other words. In fact, I think it's a fairly common technique in comedy, perhaps tragedy as well, actually, to show how disastrously an over-reliance on abstract thinking at the expense of intuition can fail us in our relationships with other people. For me, Curb Your Enthusiasm comes to mind, but I think it's kind of everywhere in comedy. Abstract, if you like, calculating or legalistic thinking shows our hard edge, our rational but also our inflexible, judgmental, or even obtuse side to others. And the same goes for the arts. Inspiration doesn't work through this logical process, but seems something more like a kind of immediate knowing, seeing of sorts. We even see this kind of distinction between hard and soft in the work world, where we speak of hard skills as the ones that are more on the abstract side, where soft skills are those in which intuition is more involved. So anyway, Agathon concludes this set of 5 speeches, claiming to have spoken both jokingly and seriously at the same time. And so this series of speeches ends with us waiting for Socrates to take his turn. In some ways, this part of the symposium is actually kind of baffling. How are we to take each of these 5 speeches? It seems, as I mentioned a couple of episodes ago, that they're really all intended to be partly in fun, partly serious. So how do we separate the comical from the serious? And then how are we to take them as a group? There seems quite a diversity of opinion here. Is this intended to be a collection of views on Eros that Socrates in the end simply demolishes and replaces? Or is his account, which crowns the dialogue, supposed to be complementary with them in some way? Is it possible they're meant to be understood as a kind of ladder to the Socratic viewpoint? And we'll see the ladder something of a motif in this dialogue. A movement, that's to say, are they a movement in thought that progressively suggests or approaches the Socratic perspective? And if that's the case, what's the hidden pattern behind this? In what way exactly do the speakers approach the solution that Socrates eventually gives? The dialogue has raised these and many other questions for scholars, and scholars have come up with a fascinating array of different answers for them. My own view, and this may sound a bit paradoxical, is that despite the great diversity of these speeches, at the same time, I think there's a sense in which they're all Plato. The hand of Plato runs through them all. That's to say, even though in their details or in their superficial meaning, they may be at odds with the Socratic teaching, at the same time, they all on some level get at that teaching. They prefigure it and end up being in a way complementary with it. Somehow, through all this diversity of opinion about Eros, a coherent picture of it, a fuzzy but sort of coherent picture of it, nevertheless seems to be taking shape, even when these speakers seem to disagree with one another and with Socrates, especially in retrospect, because Diotima's solution, that is the core, Diotima's solution is the core of Socrates' speech, which is in turn the core of the dialogue. And Diotima's solution will make plain to us how they fail, but also how they succeed. And so by the end of the dialogue, we have a kind of wondrous vision of unity in diversity, or diversity in unity. And this is actually at the heart of the whole Platonic philosophy, and the ultimate source, I think, of its great hope and beauty. Looking back at these speeches, we're left, I think, with a wondrous picture that teems with variety. But because these speeches seem in a way to complement one another, there's not just pure difference here, but a kind of harmony. Before we can get to that, though, the brilliant success of these speeches, it will be critical, I think, for us to look at how they fail, because that's also a really important part of this dialogue. And that's what I'll be talking about next time. I hope to see you then. And until then, thanks for watching.